Hey, everybody. I am Charlie Matthews. I'm the founder and CEO of Empowering Pumps and Equipment. And today on our Knowledge Shared, we are going to hear from our friend Alex about the economic and labor market update. He gives us this on a regular basis now because he is our favorite. I can say that. But we also really want to know what to expect from 2023 and beyond. This is a challenging time for a lot of us. And we're going to rely on you, Alex, to kind of give us the way and then some resources I know that you have. So thank you for being here. Thank you to Miller Resource Group for allowing you to speak with us today as well. And I'll just let you take it from here, Alex.
Sounds great, Charlie. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be talking to all of you again. I appreciate the very important role that you've bestowed upon me to kind of shed the light on the macro environment and help you see a little bit around the corner in terms of what to expect. And most importantly, as always, I try to connect the dots for you based on what you're seeing in the data and what it means to you as decision makers, as business leaders, how you should be running your organizations based on what's going on in that environment that you operate in. So we'll separate our talk today into three sections. The first one, I'll talk a little bit about the consumer side of the US economy. Then we'll shift gears and talk about the industrial segment. And then I'll wrap it up with the labor market update, all the way through highlighting the important things that you really need to focus on so you can cut through the noise and actually pull the levers that need pulling as we navigate this environment of uncertain economic times and really operate in a world that's drastically different than what we're used to over the last 24 months since the pandemic hit us. So let's start by taking kind of the 50,000-foot view, looking at the global economy. Again, I like to remind people that the United States remains at the leadership position on the global economic landscape. We are still substantially larger than China. So despite all of the kind of negativity that you hear about the Chinese taking us over for the pole position, or the U.S. Currency, the dollar, losing its position as the de facto currency of global trade to the Chinese renminbi or the yuan, however you like to call it. That's just simply not true. As you can see, we are still over 25% larger than China. This is as of 2022. Now, there are still projections, as you can see here, that China's GDP is projected to surpass that of the US. I'm skeptical on that, I'll be honest with you. And this is a chart that comes from a great resource, by the way, called Visual Capitalist. If you're not following them, they have great sets of visualizations that take economic and technological data and put it into easy to digest content. But I would say that I'm not as concerned based on what we're seeing out of China, not only in terms of their slowing growth rates, but also in terms of what's going on demographically, in terms of the side that they've obviously chosen in the Russia-Ukraine war and the implications of that to their trade with the US, with Europe, and the rest of the world. So I'm a little bit less gung-ho that China is imminently looming to take over our position. But I think the important thing to note here is that in addition to the United States being at the top and China being in second place, if you look at the global economy, it really boils down to three key areas: US, China, and then Europe. So as you can see in the top 10, we've got Germany, United Kingdom, France, Italy, all show up as part of that Western European power bloc. And together, these three entities account for about 2/3 of the global economy. So China plus US plus Europe is 2/3 of overall global GDP. You throw in Japan and India into the mix, and we're talking about 75% of the global economy. I will also take a moment to point out this tiny little circle down here, Russia, 1.8 trillion. It's important to know that while they command a disproportionately large portion of your attention span and all of news coverage, their economy is really just a fraction, less than 10% of ours. In fact, the city of New York has a greater economy than all of Russia combined. So put things into context a little bit. From a macroeconomic landscape, they're really not that much of a player in the global stage. And it's important to remember that their actions can affect the world's landscape, particularly in some sectors: food production, the production of things like aluminum and nickel, which is used in a lot of obviously industrial products, including pumps and compressors. But despite all of that, right, despite all of the things that we had going on over the course of 2022 with the different variants of COVID-19, with surging inflation coupled with aggressive interest rate hikes from the Fed. We had massive supply chain issues, growing backlogs, scarcity of components like semiconductors and other electronics, and of course, a war going on full scale, right? The US and the global economies still managed to grow through all of that. You can see here, we are at a record high as of the end of 2022, $104 trillion. And so it is important to start from the context of the natural state of both the global and the US economy is that of growth, right? If you think about when we go through periods of contraction or recession, it is oftentimes something that is a self-inflicted wound. So if you think about, for example, the pandemic, right? That's not necessarily us doing it to ourselves, but it's clearly there's still some questions about where the virus actually emerged from, but it was not a natural macroeconomic event. It was a black swan event. If you think about the 2008, 2009 crisis, that was self-inflicted because of the misbehavior on Wall Street, the financial crisis, and what was going on in the housing market at the time. 2000, 2001, the tech bubble, right? You go back to the 80s, the oil embargo. And so all of these things are, us basically getting in our own way. So what we're going through right now, and I've affectionately started to refer to it as the recession, is another one of those circumstances where the US Fed, certainly the body that governs interest rate policy, is basically trying to clamp down on inflation and make sure that the job market doesn't get overheated the way that it was in 2022. And so they're doing that by raising interest rates, in effect, trying to stymie economic activity. And we're starting to see the signs of that actually taking place. But again, it is self-imposed. We want to lower inflation. We want to have more availability of talent and workers in the labor force. But in order to do that, we really have to address the fundamental disconnect between supply and demand that exists right now. And the way that we're doing that is by affecting the demand side, by charging more for borrowing costs, therefore stymieing borrowing and investment activity, and then creating this milder economic climate that we are expecting in the second half of 2023 and onwards into early 2024 as well. So that's kind of the big picture view. Now, if we zoom in a little bit to the United States, as far as I can tell, all the data says that through the latest available data point, which is the Q4 of 2022 data for GDP, we're at a record high, right? I mean, it's very palpable to tell that on the chart here. We're now north of $20 trillion. That hasn't happened, as you can see, until recently, ever in the history of the US economy before. So it's a very great success story. But at the same time, it's important to look at this data in multiple ways, right? Because if you want to get some insights and some takeaways that are actionable in nature, you can't just look at the top line. One of the things that I talk about with business leaders all the time is you can't just judge your performance based on revenue. You have to look at your rates of change. You have to look at your profitability metrics, right? It's not enough to just have your top line growth. You also have to be profitable while you do that and make sure that you are in positive rate of change territory. So when we look at this GDP data in just like a slightly different way by ascertaining the rates of change rather than the top line dollars associated with economic activity, the picture is quite different. So that's what I'm looking at in this graph here. This is the quarter over quarter rate of change. The reason why we use that metric is because GDP is released once every 3 months. So we're essentially comparing here like Q4 of 2022 to Q4 of 2021 to get the latest data point here. And as you can see, after the surge that we experienced in our GDP growth post-pandemic, we have been coming down and decelerating in that rate of change profile. Now, we're still positive, and you'll notice that the level that we're currently at, which is kind of around that 2% mark, is actually on par with other periods of economic expansion in the US. But the question becomes, what can we expect as we move forward? And the best way for us to ascertain that is to really think about what is it that accounts for the majority of economic activity in this country. And the way that we do that is by looking at the GDP breakdown. So here on the right-hand side, you can see there are 3 different colored sections. The largest by far, the blue section, reflects personal consumption expenditures. What is that exactly? Very simple. It's the money that you and I spend to live our daily lives. It's the money we spend at restaurants, going clothing shopping, buying electronics, all of the things that we consume as individuals accounts for over 2/3 of overall economic activity in the United States. Now, the other two segments are also important, and we'll address some of them in later episodes, but I just wanted you to realize that government spending accounts for about 17%, and a similar figure is made up for by gross private domestic investment, or as I like to refer to, this is the industrial side of the economy. This is the B2B side of the economy, and this is where most of your organizations reside in. So we'll have a more detailed look at that component in another episode. But right now, if we look at this blue area, it's very evident it is the US consumer that is responsible for the majority of the economic expansion in this country. We are the engine, if you will, in the car that is the US economy. And here, if you look at that data for GDP, this area in particular amuses me a little bit. This is Q1 and Q2 of 2022. If you'll recall, this time last year, everybody was talking about recession. What's the technical definition? Well, I mean, yes, technically speaking, we did have 2 consecutive quarters of contraction in the US economy, but the first quarter was only a result of this negative number here. The difference was that we imported more things than we exported, and that acts as a negative, a detractor to overall economic activity. But certainly supply and demand was not in recession at that time. And Q2 was an inventory destocking issue. Again, kind of a fluke in the system. Yes, the numbers actually ended up being negative, but I don't believe that what we went through in the first half of 2022 should qualify as a recession. In fact, NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is an organization that retroactively classifies periods of contraction as recessionary, they have not come out and said that, yes, in fact, we did have a recession during the first half of 2022. So when you listen to things on television, when you read articles, when you go online and you hear all these pundits kind of sell fear and noise, and they're really trying to drum up kind of anxiety in people, don't buy into that. Try to do your best to get some reliable source of information that are not driven by emotion, not driven by fear, and are driven by data. That's how you can make good quality decisions, not only in your business life, but in your personal life as well. So going back to that consumer side of the economy, one of the best ways for us to illustrate consumer behavior is by leveraging this series called retail sales. And retail sales encompasses both trade and food services. So it's a fairly large series, as you can see here, over $8 trillion. So in context of the overall economy, this one data series accounts for over 40%, considering that we're a $20 trillion economy now. And what you can see here is that we had a very unusual thing happen once we kind of came out of the lockdown period. Not only did we get back to growth, but it was really an unprecedented level of growth. Because if you look at the kind of historic trend line of where we would have been otherwise, had the pandemic not taken place, I think it would have been substantially lower amount of economic activity as measured by retail sales than what we actually witnessed. So this is an aberration in the data, and what we're going through right now, and this is true both for the consumer side that we're looking at now, it's also going to be true for the industrial side, which is a basically reversion to the mean. We are coming back to typical trend lines that were reflective of US economic activity before the craziness and the volatility and the outliers of the pandemic manifested themselves in things like this surge in retail activity. So it is okay for us to take a step back from this very steep cliff that we've climbed and try to normalize a little bit the distinction between supply and demand fundamentals in order to battle things like inflation, which nobody likes to have inflation at north of 9% the way that we did in 2022, right? It's come down substantially. It's still elevated. We're at about 6% today, but still, I mean, it's important to understand that it's almost a healthy thing for the US to go through a little bit of a cool down when it comes to our economic activity. And that's exactly what you're seeing here. It's that same retail data that is plotted as rates of change as opposed to the raw dollars, as I mentioned earlier. And again, you can see it is clearly on what is called the backside of the US economic business cycle. It is coming off of the peak, both in terms of the annual rates of change and the quarterly rates of change. And what you need to understand is that the fact that these are, that the white line, which is the shorter term growth rate, is below the orange line, which is the longer term growth rate, actually means that we're likely to going to see ongoing deceleration, further slowdown, at least over the next 6 months. That's the typical lead time between that 3-month growth rate and the annualized rate of change. So we're slowing in the GDP, we're slowing in the retail environment. And as we look out to the future, the rest of Q2, and certainly the rest of this year and beyond, the question becomes, can the US consumer effectively continue to spend money at a level that is not going to make this recession a severe one? And so to judge whether or not they are able to do that, we have to look at the state of consumer debt. And a very easy way to think about where do we owe the money that we owe is by looking at kind of how that debt is distributed amongst the different vehicles of debt that we carry. What you'll see here is that mortgages, by the way, most of this green area is reflective of 3% to 4% 30-year mortgages. That accounts for the vast majority of our debt, 70%. If you throw in HELOCs, the home equity lines of credit, we're talking about north of 72% of overall debt that Americans hold. This is not a problem area. It is causing some segments of the US economy, like the housing market, some challenges, right? Because people that are locked into a 3 or 3.5 year, 30-year mortgage are not wanting to sell their home and go buy one at 6 or 7%, right? So there are some sector-specific challenges that it drives. But overall, from a consumer spending ability perspective, this is not an issue as it stands today. There are some other segments that are more problematic. For example, auto loans, which account for just over 9% of overall debt, and credit cards at just under 6%. So combined, you're talking about, roughly speaking, 15% of our debt is privy to some of those interest rate hikes that I mentioned before. You know, the typical note on a vehicle now is somewhere between 7 and 8%. If you're signing up for a kind of a 60-month rate, the typical credit card rate has now gone north of 20%. And so as we eroded the savings that we were able to put together during the pandemic, and as we rely on credit card debt more and more to finance our spending activity, that is costing us more in terms of the interest rates that credit card companies charge everyone. And so we really need to look very carefully at this segment of our debt to figure out whether or not it's becoming a problem. And we'll do so in just a second. The credit card, the student loan component that you see here in the red or pink slice, that is still subject to the moratorium. And as long as that remains in place, it's not an area of concern. So how do we tell whether or not we're in kind of red flag or warning territory on any of these individual categories? The best way to do that is by looking at delinquency, meaning how good are we at keeping up with the payments that we have to be making on these various debt instruments. And what I want you to see here across a long period of time, so this is going back all the way to 2003, is that despite the fact that we're seeing rise in the auto loan category and rise in credit cards and some mild rise in the mortgage category, all of these are still at levels that are not only, like in the case of mortgages, at historic lows relative to where we have been in the past, right? If you track this kind of tannish, orangish line, yes, we're starting to see some of this rise, but it's still substantially below where we were pre-pandemic. The same thing can be said in the case of auto loans and credit cards. Now, they are rising, and these are rising at a steeper angle than what we see in the mortgage category. So we should continue to pay attention to these and use the latest readings from these data sets to say, are the US consumers really starting to get themselves into trouble? Is this likely going to affect their spending propensity as we look out to the future? But as of right now, I can tell you, based on where we've been historically during previous periods of economic sustainable growth, I'm not concerned just yet. As always, the devil is in the details. So, for example, in the auto loan category, it is remarkable to note that the average loan now for a Gen Z buying a new car is $1,000 a month, which to me, being a old school Gen Xer seems crazy because I'm still used to having a car payment of somewhere between $250 and $500. And that's kind of like the norm, right? So to think about having a monthly car payment of $1,000 a month and its ability to influence how I can spend money in other facets of my life, that's pretty remarkable and certainly is a concern. So I'm going to watch this very carefully on your behalf. I recommend that you follow along with the data and use that to really start to see if the economy is making that really serious turn into, spiking delinquency rates, particularly from a historic context, and whether or not that's going to affect the US consumer's ability to continue to carry the economy forward and create an environment where any recession we face is likely to be mild or more severe in nature. So with that, we'll wrap it up here for US consumers. Stay tuned for the next episode that's going to focus on the US industrial economy.
Thank you, Alex. I absolutely love that. I love that you pointed out that, don't focus on that fear. Really go in and look at the details and the data to support that. I think that that's really something that does affect us. But I do think that you gave us some great tools, and I can't wait to look into that more on a personal level and make sure that I'm making the right decisions as my kid goes to college and is about to get new cars and things like that. Thank you, Alex, and look forward to our next episode.
Fantastic. Take care, Charlie.